Hey, I'm really glad that you're here. I'm really glad I'm here too. We are continuing the Grudge message series, and I'm excited about that. This series has been talking about forgiveness, getting over grudges, and sometimes I think grudges can happen without us even realizing it. We started out in week 1, we talked about the small things, like we wanted to get over it. Don't let the small things bother us. And then in week 2, we talked about the faith to forgive. We talked about the big things, stuff that has caused real major pain in our lives that it's kind of maybe we've hung on to, and forgiveness is a little tougher. But we also realized that when we forgive, we set ourselves free. Then next week, in the final week, we're going to be talking about forgiving ourselves and our struggles. Sometimes it's almost easier to forgive others. We hold on to this. Today, the title is Forgiving God, with a question mark. It's kind of technically we don't really forgive God because he doesn't sin, but sometimes we act like God has done us wrong. And we may feel like God has let us down, or he didn't do something we thought he should have, and it can turn into a grudge. And I want to talk about that today, because the last thing we want is a grudge against God, right? We want to be at peace with him. We want to be reconciled. So I want to talk about this a bit, and, talk about us and God and how we're doing. And, we've all heard stories of kind of miracles, miraculous things God has done. I think every one of us probably knows somebody in our lives where something miraculous has happened. God has transformed someone's life. He's fixed their marriage. He's helped their finances, or in some way. I remember in a previous church I attended, there was this guy who got up and testified one week. He said he'd never been one who tithed. And he said he was going to give it a shot and try and do it. It kind of scared him. And he started paying, giving 10% to God before his bills. And he testified, he said, after I did this, somehow I had enough money for all of my bills, and God blessed me financially. It really impacted the church in a major way. But then I thought, well, maybe some of you have been tithing for years, and right now your bills are crushing you, right? You're feeling like, well, where's my miracle? Where's God's answer to my prayer? And see, those kind of feelings can get us sort of almost having a bit of grudge against God. Like years ago, this was a long time, it was probably 15 years ago, a friend of mine was telling me this really long, elaborate story about how God had blessed them with this nice house. And I was standing in the nice house at the time, amazing kitchen. And she just said about how, all the right people came together, and the timing was perfect. And, at the time, I was living in a very small, adequate duplex. In fact, I still live in that small, adequate duplex 15 years later. And I could be saying, well, where's my blessing? Where's my big house, right? And so maybe you've listened to people tell stories about how they prayed for, their sick pet, or how God healed them, or some amazing thing, and you're thinking that, I prayed for someone I loved who was really sick, and God didn't heal them, right? And so this is a tough one, because we see God doing amazing things, but he doesn't always do it for me in my timing. Sometimes we might want a tendency to say, where's my miracle? Why didn't God help me when I prayed? And so point number 1 today, I'm going to talk about, what do you do when you feel you've been wronged by God? What do you feel like, God sort of did you wrong, or he wasn't there for you? God came through for somebody else, but not for me. I prayed for something good, something that God would want. Nothing happened. Didn't work, right? But somebody else got a new car, when they prayed for it, and you're like, that just doesn't seem right. And so, I don't know if you think about these kind of things, but I feel like a grudge against God is probably one of the worst ones we can have, because God doesn't sin, God doesn't do wrong, and if you're angry with God about something you feel he's done you wrong with, we have to come to grips with that. We have to figure that out. I mean, maybe you've been really disappointed in God. You feel like he's come through for a lot of people I know, not for me. Maybe it wasn't something you didn't get. Maybe it was something you think God should have done, and he didn't. Some sickness or a problem with one of your children or some tragic event that God could have stopped, you know. And so that can lead us to holding a grudge against God. And, you know, I don't know if you've ever felt like that, or maybe you're feeling like that now. Well, if you have, I want you to know you've come to the right place, because we're going to talk about that today. And I'm going to be sharing a Bible story that I think really will offer some insight and hope, and it kind of help us, well, how do we get through this? And so today, the title, Forgiving God, ? Remember, it's kind of a problem. We don't really forgive God because he does everything, he doesn't sin. But when we feel like we've been let down by God, it almost feels like we need to, even though we don't. So how do we fix this problem? You know, how do we let go of our grudges with God? How can we come to peace with God, be reconciled with him? And I want to share a story from 1 Samuel chapter 1. Interestingly, Karen shared this story about Hannah in the Amazing Stories series back in July. I'm going to be coming kind of at a different angle on this one. But so the story should be familiar. Our goal is to learn from Hannah about how she was able to love and trust God and be faithful to him when she felt like God was not there for her. And Hannah is she's a pretty amazing person in the Bible. She found a way to reconcile with God over her disappointments. It's very powerful. So I'm going to give you a little background on the story. Hannah was a woman named to this guy named Elkanah. And Elkanah had 2 wives. It was very common in the olden days. And so he married Hannah and Peninnah. And overall, Elkanah seems like a good guy, a righteous man, good husband. We're not really told the story behind the 2 wives. A lot of people think, and scholars think, that it was likely that maybe he married Hannah first, and she wasn't able to have any kids, which was a huge, huge thing in those days. And so then he married Peninnah, and she was able to have kids. But children were so important because there was workers for your household. It was your legacy. I mean, that's still something we care about today, your name being carried on. But a lack of children for a wife meant she was a terrible failure. Now, it's an awful thing, but that's how people felt in those days, and that's how Hannah felt. Now, I just want to say that the whole multiple wife thing in the Bible is a really bad idea. If we could go back in time and talk to Elkanah or any of these other guys, they would say, not a good thing. Now, you might think, when you watch, reality TV like The Bachelor or something, you see a guy, he's got this harem of women, and he's dating 3 of them a day, and it just seems like that would be wonderful. Well, it's not. And the show is designed for everyone to be jealous of everybody, and we enjoy the fighting. That's what these reality shows are about. But anyway, that's what happens in real life. In real life, what happened was Hannah and the other wife, Peninnah, were rivals. They were adversaries. They lived in a world where childbearing, and a lot of it meant you were a valuable person. You were valuable. That was kind of the pinnacle of their existence. And so it led to this warring between the 2 competing wives. And so Elkanah and his family would take this yearly pilgrimage to the temple to worship. And this is when the rivalry would hit a peak. Because, Elkanah would give according to, how many kids you had and all this, and Hannah was left out, and there was this taunt. It was just a bad situation. And so I want to pick up here 1 Samuel 1, 6 and 7. It said, so Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. So, I'm sure it was bad all the time, but then it really hit bad at this time they went to the temple. And so what we see in the Bible, Hannah was a very kind, she was a godly woman. Seems like someone that you would probably want as your friend, caring, very sincere, seeking what's right. Now her rival, Peninnah, doesn't quite come off that way. She was the taunting one. She was kind of cruel. And today we would think, who would be so cruel as to taunt someone over infertility? we would never, at least we wouldn't do it publicly, and hopefully we would do it privately, right? But Penn and I was like, hey, I got the kids, you don't. And so Hannah reacted like many of us would, who, when we have a problem, she prayed. And so I want you to know, Karen and I have dealt with this problem, this issue of infertility. And, we've been married now almost 40 years. Wow. Anyway, and so in the first 10, you're not even sure when you want to start having kids. And then when you do, often it doesn't happen right away. And we just figured out, it's going to take us a while. But, after 10, 15 years, you start to think, what's going on here? So we were very concerned. We prayed a lot about this. I imagine Karen and I had a lot of the same feelings Hannah did. Hannah probably was praying, why do you bless Penn but not me with children? At the time, in the 90s, Karen and I, when we were much younger, we were very active in youth ministry. And so our church got the reputation as ministering to the non-church kids. So most of our youth group, their parents didn't come to church. They were sort of rough. And oftentimes, I could tell you stories, when you have to call the cops to youth group, or you take the kids on a field trip and one of them gets pinched for shoplifting. It's like, oh. So, this was our life in the 90s working with the teens. And so these were rough kids who needed the Lord, and of course what often happens too with that is some of the girls in our youth group would get pregnant. And here we are, we're ministering to them. They have this child that's on the way that they don't really want and can't really care for. And here we are, we're praying, we want kids, So this is I can totally relate to Hannah, But Hannah's story is, it's about her not having kids, but it's also about this mistreatment she received from her rival. And, I would think when it comes to having grudges against God, this would be really easy to do. Now, I'm going to be, Hannah's story and some of my stories about the infertility thing, but there's many, many issues that we can get grudges against God. Christians all over the world have been praying for God's help with many, many problems. In fact, right now, there's probably millions of God's people that are just praying, that God, I need your help. You got to do this thing. I'm in a terrible situation. And they prayed. So Hannah prayed, Karen and I prayed. Probably all of you have prayed at times, and you said, God, you got to help me with this thing. Whatever it is, you need a job with benefits to support your family. You pray, nothing happened. Or you've struggled with depression for years, and you've asked God to make it go away. Or you prayed for someone who's very sick to get well. And or you prayed for someone you love to get saved and know the Lord, discover God. Or you prayed for God to make your marriage better. Just doesn't seem to get any better. And so there's all sorts of people struggling with this, with issues where we're like, God, we need you to do something. And all these things affect us. We wake up one day and you realize, hey, I got a bit of a grudge against God. I feel like he did me wrong, right? And we can have those feelings. Now, in Hannah's case, it didn't work that way, thankfully. She prayed to God, and I'm going to pick up here in verse 8 of 1 Samuel chapter 1. And Elkanah, her husband, is kind of trying to help her. And he says, why are you crying, Hannah? Elkanah would ask. Why aren't you eating? Don't be downhearted just because you have no children. You have me. Isn't that better than having 10 sons? Once after a sacrificial, I'm going to get to that. Once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And sometimes I wonder if it wasn't Elkanah, her husband Elkanah's, shall I say, stupid, insensitive comment that actually led her to pray. That might have been what drove her away. She left. She wasn't going to eat her meal, and she was just going to go to the tabernacle to pray. And that might have been the final straw. And so one thing you can always be sure of, Elkanah shows us, whatever you're struggling with, whatever your issue, whatever's really bothering you, troubling you deeply within, maybe even the reason you have your grudge against God, you can be sure someone is going to say something stupid and insensitive to you, just like Elkanah. You know, in those days when Karen and I were figuring out, hey, it doesn't look like we can have kids easily, and we'd have people just say, well, they'd find out for the first time and say, well, have you tried adoption? I just wanted to say, haven't been able to have kids for 15 years. It never occurred to me that there's some. I just want to say, of course, we've thought of everything, And when people do that, they're not trying to be insensitive. They're trying to be helpful. But when for someone in the middle of it, that's not what Hannah needed to hear. So Hannah's in her distress. She's like, I got to leave this guy. I got to go pray. And she says she cries bitterly and talks to the Lord. I don't know if you've ever been there. You're like, God, whatever is going on, I just can't take it. You're just emotional. You're upset. You're angry. You're crying out to God. Now Eli sees her, and it's such ugly crying that Eli thinks she's drunk when he sees her. That's how bad she is. She's like, nope, I'm just really in distress. But Eli says, well, then I'll pray with you. And he says, may the Lord answer your prayer and bless you. And that seems to be enough for Hannah. For then she leaves, and she shows us, though, that the best place to go when you're in distress, even distress that you think God might be responsible for, it's best to pray to Him. So the next, what do you do when you feel you've been wronged by God? Well, one of the things Hannah did was she cried out to God, and she's a great example. I would love to have heard her prayer. Maybe you remember times when you've been in a similar situation to Hannah, just something that's just, you can hardly take it. You can't even eat, you're just so distressed, you just want to pray. Times when everything seems like it's falling apart. And then one more thing happens, the straw that breaks the camel's back, the insensitive comment. So she's crying bitterly, she's just all upset. And I want you to know, those are great times to talk to the Lord. When I'm feeling like that, I like talking to the Lord. I've faced some, like you, terrible situations in life where I'm upset, I'm emotional, maybe even crying, and I talk to God. And I want you to know, my prayers then don't sound like the ones I do here at church. When I'm like, Heavenly Father, please. Those sound really nice. You know what I sound like then? I'm just real and raw. That's why I love the Psalms. Very raw emotions. I tell God that I don't know what to do. I've tried everything I can think of. I'm really angry about it, and I need His help. And I just go on about it. What's great about our God is He really wants us to share our feelings with Him. He doesn't want us just to go away angry and not say anything. He'd rather we yell and cry and be mad and talk to Him than walk away. And so we learn from Hannah. She cried out to God, and the great part is you can too, right? We can do the same thing. So don't shy away from sharing your heart with God. It's a tricky situation. You don't really want to tell people you're mad at God, because that's not a good thing for a Christian to do, I guess, but you are. And so when you're mad at people, you usually don't want to talk to them. But the best thing we can do is talk to God. Tell Him how we feel. Now, what usually happens to me in those situations is after I talk a while and vent, I calm down, I kind of come to my senses, and then I begrudgingly admit that God knows better than me, and perhaps He's doing the best thing for me, and then I try and re-up on my faith and put my trust in Him. That's where I want to end up. But sometimes our grudges against God don't always end that quick. One thing I've learned that there's a benefit to the process. When you follow God, when you're angry with Him about something in your life that you actually maybe blame Him for, that's a good thing. I don't understand this. I feel like you did me wrong, but I'm going to be faithful. And that's what I see in Hannah. And so I'm going to put it in a couple different ways here in the next 2 points. Point 2, a waiting season isn't a wasted season. Right? A waiting season isn't a wasted season. When we're struggling with life, unanswered prayer, marriage problems, finance problems, overwhelming temptation, whatever it is, right? These are opportunities for us to grow in our faith. for our faith to increase. Opportunities to trust God regardless of circumstances when it's not feeling good. So a waiting season is not a wasted season. And point number 3, God's delays are not necessarily God's denials, right? Just because it's not happening right now doesn't mean it's not going to happen. God really does work in mysterious ways. For Karen and I, we have an oddest story. We couldn't have kids. We were never able to have our own children. But now I have 2 adult children who are both married and 4 grandkids. Like, that's not supposed to work that way. So I never got what I asked for. But at the same time, I got an answer to my prayer that was really good, like that I didn't expect. But we also know sometimes you don't get what you ask for. And that can be really hard. And that's what can lead to those grudges against God. So my goal today is that when we all leave here today, we're going to be reconciled with God. We're going to be at peace with Him. Whatever thing is bothering us, we feel like, man, if He had stepped in and done this, everything would be better. Or if He hadn't allowed that to happen, it would all, whatever our thing is. So if you have something against God, you feel like He hasn't, anything that's a grudge or something growing into the grudge for how He's handled your life, today is the day to overcome it, right? Let's do it today and restart our relationship with God. And it begins by telling God how you feel with prayer, just like Hannah did. Elkanah, Hannah, and that whole family show us what to do. Hannah prayed, and then they all went out and they worshiped together. Toward the end of the chapter, verses 19 and 20, it says, the entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. Then they returned home to Ramah. So they did their pilgrimage, they worshiped, they went home. It says, when Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. Now, in Hannah's situation, she got exactly what she was asked for, powerful. But she worshiped the Lord and followed Him before it happened. I love that. She didn't let it turn into a grudge against God. Now, most of us can testify and share that some of the deepest things we wanted and prayed to God for, God came through. He finally came through. At least in some of them, right? Our prayers were answered, our problems were resolved. God did miraculous things, and many of us can share that testimony. But God doesn't always do that. He doesn't always do what we ask. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know some of these things we're never going to know the reason for in this life. What's interesting for Karen and me in my situation, we were able to come to a place a little over 20 years ago where we said, it doesn't look like we're going to have kids. Doesn't seem like there's anything we can do to fix that. And, I've got to live the rest of our life, and I want to serve the Lord, so I got to let go of this issue I got with God. I got to let go of the grudge. And so we did this more than 20 years ago. And then, less than 10 years ago, in 2013, we adopted our daughter Shamra. She had been with us as a teenager, as a foster daughter. And we just said, well, she's like family anyway, let's just make it official. And then that same year, we were able to reconnect with our son, the baby Karen had when she was a teenager. And all of a sudden, we went to this instant family, and it was so wonderful. And we were so blessed by the Lord. But I'm really thankful that I made peace with God before this. Like, it didn't take, okay, God had to throw me a bone and do something before I said, okay. I'm happy. I was like, we said, we're going, we're gonna accept this as our lot in life. We're gonna go forward. So today is the day we need to let go of those grudges against God. We need to, not really forgive God, but we need to let it go. We need to accept that God's ways are not only wise, but ultimately that's the way our life is going to go. He decides how things happen, not us. And so my prayer for every one of us is that we will follow Hannah's example, let go of our grudges against God, find peace with Him, and move forward. So with that, I want to move to next steps. They're on the back of your message notes, back of your Connect cards, and want to challenge you to some, how do we respond to this? And so first challenge, follow Hannah's example and cry out to God, letting him know my heart and my feelings. So I think a great place to start is make it a practice to share your feelings with the Lord. You can do that when you're feeling great, and you can do that when you're feeling bad. And I think this helps prevent the grudges when I can share. And because I'll be honest, when I share deep feelings like this with God, I'm really upset. Usually before it's over, the peace of God's Spirit is with me, and I have some reassurance that He's working. He's going to do something good. Maybe not exactly what I'm asking for, but I think it's, when we shut off from God like that, that's a problem. So that's a great next step. The second one says, I've been upset with God about blank. Here's my issue. I'm not happy with how God has done this in my life, but I want to trust God, and I want to let go of the grudge. And, maybe you need to just start admitting where you're at. And, it's easy to fool ourselves into thinking we're fine, everything's good. I'll be honest with you, I'm wondering if this shouldn't be my next step. My new grudge with God is this pandemic thing and what it did to stepping stones. I got to get over that. This is the reality we live in. And it's not just stepping stones, it's many things. But it's this is what God has done, this is the world we live in. So maybe it's time to just say, I'm going to trust God. I'm not going to hang on to that stuff. Third is to follow Hannah's example and worship God with all my heart, even when I'm upset. So maybe you're here today and you've got a serious grudge. You're angry. The best thing you can do is worship the Lord. Hannah shows us you can still be faithful even when everything doesn't feel right. Worshiping God is always a good thing to do. Sometimes it's the best thing we can do. And then finally, the fourth one, read 1 Samuel chapter 1. Read Hannah's story for yourself. Very powerful story of God's healing. It's amazing, miraculous power. So my prayer for every one of us is that we would be able to identify when we get upset with God, and we wouldn't hold those grudges, that we'd make peace with Him, because He really does. He's so wise. He knows what's best for us. So I pray that you will have peace with God, and that He'll lead you to a next step that will make that happen. I want to pray for you as you consider and take those next steps. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this powerful message from Hannah. And it really makes us think about our own lives and all we've been through. Lord, we want to be at peace with you. Help us when our feelings overwhelm us. We feel like, oh, God, I shouldn't have done that. To put our faith and trust in you and to share those feelings. And we just pray that we would be at peace and walking with you in our lives. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.